There's a kind of silence that only exists in cemeteries on weekday afternoons. Not the peaceful kind, not the kind that wraps around you like a warm blanket. No, this silence has teeth. It chews on you slowly, and if you let it, it'll swallow you whole. Margaret Hayes knew that silence intimately. She'd been feeding herself to it every Tuesday at exactly 3 o'clock for the past 3 years. She was 62, silver-haired, the kind of woman who still wore pearl earrings to visit a gravestone because her mother had taught her that a lady never leaves the house looking undone. She drove a black Mercedes that she never turned the radio on in, not anymore, and she lived in a house with 6 bedrooms and not a single voice echoing through the hallways. Margaret Hayes was, by every measure the world cared about, a wealthy woman, and by the only measure that actually mattered, she was bankrupt. Her daughter Emma had died 3 years ago. Car accident. A rainy Thursday night, a truck that ran a red light, and just like that, the only person who made Margaret's enormous life feel full was gone. 29 years old, a nurse, a girl who used to pick dandelions from the yard and present them to her mother like they were long-stemmed roses. Gone. And Margaret? Margaret just kept showing up to the cemetery on Tuesdays. Because when you lose your child, you don't move on. You just move. One foot, then the other. You buy groceries you barely eat. You water plants you barely see. And once a week, you stand in front of a headstone and pretend that talking to cold marble is the same as hearing your baby laugh. That particular Tuesday in October, the air had that crisp bite to it, the kind that sneaks under your collar and reminds you winter's coming whether you're ready or not. Margaret pushed through the iron gates, her heels finding their familiar rhythm on the stone path. She could walk this route blindfolded. 47 steps past the old oak tree, left at the angel statue with the chipped wing, straight ahead until the row of newer stones, the ones that still looked too clean, too sharp, like they hadn't earned their place yet. But today, something was off. She saw them before she could make sense of what she was seeing. A man kneeling beside Emma's headstone. A janitor, judging by the navy blue uniform, the kind with a name patch stitched over the chest pocket. And next to him, tucked close against his side like a small bird sheltering from wind, a little girl. 5 years old, maybe. Brown hair falling past her shoulders, a yellow sweater that was just slightly too big for her, the sleeves pushed up around her tiny wrists. She had one hand wrapped around the man's arm and the other pressed flat against the headstone, like she was trying to feel a heartbeat through the granite. They were both crying, not the loud, dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind that costs you something. Margaret felt her chest go tight. Not with sadness, with something sharper, something territorial. That was her daughter's grave, her private altar of grief. She didn't share it. She didn't want company. She wanted to be alone with whatever was left of Emma, and these strangers were sitting in her sacred space, like they belonged there. She walked faster. Her heels hit the stone like little hammers. "Excuse me." Her voice came out harder than she meant it to, or maybe exactly as hard as she meant it to. "What are you doing here? This is my daughter's grave." The man's head snapped up. Mid-30s, she guessed. Brown skin weathered by long hours and not enough rest. His eyes were the kind that had seen too much too young. But they were gentle, even startled, even caught off guard. There was a softness in them that Margaret noticed before she could stop herself. The little girl flinched. She pressed her face into her father's arm and grabbed a fistful of his uniform like she was trying to disappear into him. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," the man said quickly. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. No shame in it, just reflex, and helped the girl to her feet. "We didn't mean any disrespect. We come here sometimes. We'll go. We'll leave right now." He was already turning to walk away when Margaret's eyes dropped to the grave. And that's when she saw them. Daisies. A small bunch of them, nothing fancy, probably picked up at a grocery store for $3. But they were arranged with care, real care. The stems trimmed evenly, the blooms fanned out so each one caught the light. And beside the flowers, lying flat against the base of the headstone, was a drawing. Crayon on construction paper. 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a rainbow that stretched from one edge of the page to the other. The kind of drawing that only means something if a child made it for someone they love. Margaret stared at that drawing for a long time. Then she looked up at the man and the little girl, who were already 3 steps away, the child's small hand locked inside her father's grip. "Wait," Margaret said. Her voice was different now. She heard it herself. The sharp edge had crumbled, and what was underneath sounded fragile, almost afraid. "Please, I'd like to understand." She swallowed. "How did you know my daughter?" The man stopped walking. He looked down at the little girl, who peered up at him with wide brown eyes, full of a question only he could read. Something passed between them. Some quiet conversation that fathers and daughters have without words. He turned back to Margaret. "My name is Daniel Foster," he said. "And this is my daughter, Sophie." He paused. And when he spoke again, his voice cracked right down the middle. Your daughter Emma was the kindest person I ever met in my life. Margaret felt the words hit her somewhere below her ribs. That place where grief lives when it's not actively destroying you. Hearing her daughter's name spoken out loud by a stranger with that much reverence, it nearly took her knees out from under her. She gestured to a bench a few feet away, the old wrought iron one beneath the elm tree that had probably witnessed 1,000 conversations just like this one. Would you sit with me? She asked. Please, tell me about her. What Daniel told her next would change Margaret's life forever, and finally explain the one mystery she'd never been able to solve about her daughter's apartment. Daniel sat on the bench like a man who wasn't used to being invited to sit down. He perched on the edge, his work boots flat on the ground, his hands clasped between his knees. Sophie climbed into his lap without asking, the way children do when their parent is the only safe place they know, and she watched Margaret with eyes that were cautious but curious. Margaret sat beside them, close enough to hear, far enough to give them room. And she waited because something told her this story needed space to breathe before it could be spoken. I work as a custodian at Mercy General Hospital, Daniel began. He said it plainly, without embarrassment, but Margaret caught the way his jaw tightened slightly, the way people do when they've been made to feel small about honest work too many times. 3 years ago, my wife Sarah got sick. Cancer, the kind that doesn't negotiate with you. It just takes what it wants and dares you to keep standing. He exhaled slowly. We had nothing. No insurance, no savings. I picked up a second job mopping floors at night just to stay a few weeks behind on the bills instead of a few months. Margaret's hands tightened in her lap. She didn't interrupt. She knew better. Some stories you just hold still and receive. Emma was Sarah's nurse, Daniel said, and the way he spoke her daughter's name, carefully, like he was holding something precious between his palms, made Margaret's throat ache. She was assigned to my wife's floor, and from the very first day she was different. He shook his head, searching for the right words. You know how some people are kind because it's their job? They smile, they check the boxes, they say the right things, but you can feel the distance? Emma wasn't like that. Emma was kind because she couldn't figure out how to be anything else. Margaret let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She took care of Sarah for 6 months, Daniel continued. But it went so far beyond medical care. She'd stay after her shift, sometimes an hour, sometimes 2. She'd just sit with my wife and talk. About everything. About nothing. She'd tell Sarah stories about places she wanted to travel. She'd sneak in those little cups of good ice cream from the cafeteria, not the cheap stuff they put on the meal trays. When Sarah was having a bad day, Emma knew exactly when to talk and when to just be there. He paused, pressing his lips together. And when Sarah got too weak to speak, toward the end, when she could barely keep her eyes open, Emma would sit beside her bed and read out loud. Novels, poetry, sometimes just magazine articles about gardening because Sarah used to love her garden. Margaret closed her eyes. She could see it. She could see Emma doing every single one of those things. That girl had come into the world with her heart wide open, and she'd never learned to close it. Margaret used to worry about that, used to tell her she'd get taken advantage of, that she gave too much, that she'd burn herself out. And Emma would just smile and say, Mom, what's the point of having a light if you won't turn it on for people? What a stupid, beautiful thing to believe. One night, Daniel said, leaning forward, Emma found out something I'd been trying to hide. He glanced down at Sophie, who was tracing circles on his knee with her fingertip. I couldn't afford childcare, not even close. So I'd been bringing Sophie to the hospital with me during my overnight shifts. I'd set her up in the waiting room with a blanket and some crackers and tell her to stay put until Daddy came back. His voice dropped. She was 3 years old, sitting alone in a hospital waiting room at midnight because her father couldn't figure out another way. The shame in his voice was so raw that Margaret had to resist the urge to reach out and touch his arm. She understood that kind of shame, the kind that comes not from doing something wrong, but from not being able to do enough. Emma found Sophie one night, found curled up on 2 plastic chairs, pushed together, holding a stuffed animal, wide awake and scared. And Emma just... He stopped, pressed his hand over his mouth for a second, collected himself. She just picked her up, carried her to the break room, made her a little bed out of blankets, warmed up some milk, and from that night on, whenever I had the overnight shift, Emma would watch Sophie. Margaret opened her eyes. She'd bring books from home, coloring supplies, little toys she'd picked up at thrift stores. She turned the break room into this tiny kingdom for my daughter. She taught Sophie how to draw, how to hold the crayons right, how to mix colors. She'd read to her until she fell asleep, and then she'd sit right there beside her, doing her own paperwork, making sure Sophie wasn't alone. The children's books. It hit Margaret like a wave breaking against a seawall. After Emma's accident, she'd gone to her daughter's apartment to sort through her things, the most brutal task any parent can perform. And she'd found boxes of children's books, picture books, chapter books, coloring pads, crayons, small stuffed animals. She hadn't understood it. Emma didn't have children. She wasn't dating anyone with kids. Margaret had assumed maybe they were donations, or things Emma planned to give away. Now she understood. Every single one of those books, those toys, those little markers of childhood, they'd been for Sophie. "I didn't know," Margaret whispered, her voice barely held together. "She never told me any of this." Daniel smiled, a sad, knowing smile that made him look both older and younger at the same time. "That was Emma," he said. "She never wanted anyone to make a fuss. She never wanted recognition or praise. She just saw a problem and fixed it. She saw a scared little girl and loved her. It was that simple for her." Sophie, who had been quiet this whole time, listening in the way children do, absorbing everything even when adults think they're not paying attention, suddenly spoke up. Her voice was so small it almost got lost in the breeze. "Miss Emma gave me this." She reached into the pocket of her yellow sweater and pulled out a stuffed rabbit. It was worn soft, the kind of soft that only comes from being held every single night for years. One ear was slightly bent. A seam along the belly had been stitched shut with thread that didn't quite match. This rabbit had been loved within an inch of its life. She said, whenever I missed Mommy, I should hug Mr. Hops. Sophie looked up at Margaret with those enormous brown eyes. "And remember that love never goes away." Margaret broke. Not dramatically, not loudly. She simply put her hand over her face and let the tears come, hot and fast and completely beyond her control, because her daughter had given this child the exact same words she used to say to Margaret when Margaret's own mother had passed. "Love never goes away, Mom. It just changes shape." Emma had been out there in the world, quietly carrying the best of everything Margaret had taught her and passing it on to people Margaret had never even met. But Daniel wasn't finished. What he said next would explain the flowers, the drawings, and 3 years of devotion to a woman who could no longer hear their gratitude. Daniel was quiet for a long moment after Sophie showed Margaret the rabbit. He held his daughter a little tighter, the way you do when you're about to say something that costs you. "Sarah passed away 3 years ago," he said. "Right here in that hospital. Emma was beside her when it happened. She held my wife's hand so Sarah wouldn't be alone, because I was downstairs mopping a hallway and they couldn't reach me in time." He swallowed hard. "Emma stayed with Sarah until I got there. And when I walked into that room and saw my wife gone, Emma didn't say anything. She didn't give me some rehearsed speech about peace or God's plan. She just stood up and put her arms around me and let me fall apart. And then she went to the waiting room and held Sophie and told her that Mommy had gone to live in the stars." Margaret pressed her fingers against her lips. She was shaking, not from cold. 2 weeks later, Daniel continued, his voice dropping to almost nothing, "we heard about Emma's accident." He looked straight at Margaret then, eye to eye. And she saw it. The grief of a man who'd buried his wife and then lost the only person who'd made that loss survivable. Sophie and I, we were destroyed all over again. We wanted to come to the funeral, but we didn't know if we'd be welcome. We were nobody to Emma's family, just a janitor and his kid. We didn't have the right clothes, we didn't know anyone, so we stayed away. He looked back toward the headstone. But we needed somewhere to say goodbye. So one morning, before my shift, I brought Sophie here. We sat right where we are now, and we just talked to her. Told her we missed her. Told her Sophie drew a picture of Mr. Hops, and it felt like she could hear us. So we kept coming back. For 3 years. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. Daniel nodded. Every week, sometimes twice, usually early, 5, 6 in the morning before anyone else shows up. We bring flowers when we can swing it. Daisies were Sarah's favorite, and Emma used to bring them to Sarah's room, so it felt right. And Sophie, she draws pictures every week. She puts one here and keeps one at home. Margaret sat with that. She sat with the image of this man, waking up before dawn, getting his daughter dressed, driving to a cemetery in the dark to kneel beside a grave and whisper thank you to a woman who could no longer hear him. Doing it not once, not as a gesture, but every single week for 3 years, with grocery store daisies and crayon drawings, while Margaret had been rattling around her 6-bedroom house, feeling like the loneliest woman on earth. She'd been so consumed by what she'd lost that she'd forgotten what Emma had built. "Daniel," she said, and her voice broke on his name. "I'm sorry I spoke to you the way I did. I've been so buried in my own grief that I forgot. I forgot that Emma's life was bigger than just me. She touched people I never knew about. She left pieces of herself everywhere, and I was too blind to see it." Daniel shook his head gently. "You have nothing to apologize for. You lost your daughter. There's no grief bigger than that. No one gets to tell you how to carry it." They sat together in the quiet. Not the sharp-toothed silence Margaret was used to. Something softer. Something shared. The elm tree above them dropped a few leaves, golden and slow, and Sophie watched them spiral down like she was memorizing the way they fell. "Daniel," Margaret said finally, Would you and Sophie come to dinner this week? I'd love to hear more about Emma. The parts of her life I missed." She paused. "And I think she would have wanted us to know each other." Daniel looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. The guardedness melted. What replaced it was pure, unfiltered gratitude, the kind that doesn't need words but finds them anyway. "We'd be honored, ma'am. Margaret, please." Sophie tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, can I show Miss Margaret my drawings of Miss Emma?" "Of course, sweetheart." Sophie slid off his lap and crouched on the ground, unzipping a small backpack that Margaret hadn't noticed before. She pulled out a folder, the cheap plastic kind from a dollar store, and opened it with the kind of reverence most people save for holy books. Inside were dozens of drawings, page after page of crayon and marker and colored pencil. Emma reading a book with Sophie curled beside her. Emma in her nurse's scrubs with a stethoscope around her neck. Emma with a huge smile and yellow hair that Sophie had drawn like rays of sunshine shooting out from her head. Emma holding Mr. Hops. Emma and Sophie under a blanket fort. Emma with angel wings. Margaret went through every single one. She didn't rush. She held each drawing like it was a photograph. Because in a way, they were snapshots of her daughter's heart, drawn by the small hands of someone who'd loved her. "These are beautiful, Sophie," she said. "Would you like to see pictures of Emma when she was a little girl? Just like you?" Sophie's entire face changed. "Really? I have albums full of them, and I have her favorite books from when she was your age. I think she'd want you to have them." That dinner became a Tuesday tradition. Every week, Margaret would meet Daniel and Sophie at the cemetery, and they'd drive back to her house together. Margaret made tea and cookies, real ones, homemade, from recipes she hadn't touched in years. She dug out photo albums and spread them across the living room floor, and Sophie would sit cross-legged and point at every picture and ask, what was she doing here? Was she happy here? Did she like butterflies too? And Margaret would answer every question, and Daniel would add his own stories. The late nights, the ice cream cups, the way Emma would sing softly when she thought no one was listening. Slowly, so slowly Margaret almost didn't notice. Her house stopped being quiet. It stopped being a museum of grief. It started being a home again. She helped Daniel get Sophie enrolled in a better school, one with an art program, because that girl had something special in those small hands. She set up a college fund, not as charity, never as charity, as something Emma would have done herself if she'd had the chance. And Daniel, this man who scrubbed floors for a living and never once complained about it, he started showing up on weekends to fix things around Margaret's house. A leaky faucet, a stuck window, a gate hinge that had been squeaking for 2 years. He never asked for anything in return. He just showed up with his toolbox and his daughter, and he made things work again. Sophie started calling her Grandma Margaret. The first time it happened, Margaret had to leave the room because the tears came so fast she couldn't see. 6 months after that October afternoon, the three of them stood together at Emma's grave. Sophie knelt down and placed her latest drawing against the headstone. 4 stick figures, 2 at the top with wings and halos, Mommy and Miss Emma, smiling in a cotton candy sky, 2 at the bottom, Daddy and Grandma Margaret, holding hands on green grass. And connecting them all, stretching from heaven to earth, was a single golden thread drawn in shimmering crayon. Margaret touched the headstone the way she always did. But today, the words she whispered were different. "Thank you, Emma. Thank you for bringing them to me." As they walked back toward the iron gates, Sophie reached up and slipped her small hand into Margaret's, 5 tiny fingers wrapping around weathered ones, and Margaret understood, finally, completely, what her daughter had known all along. That kindness is never wasted, that love doesn't stop when someone leaves, it just finds new hands to hold. And that sometimes, in the deepest valley of your grief, Grace shows up wearing a janitor's uniform, holding grocery store daisies, led by a 5-year-old girl with a stuffed rabbit and a heart full of crayon drawings. Margaret Hayes had come to a cemetery looking for her daughter, and she found her, not beneath the stone, but alive, in the laughter of a little girl who still hugged Mr. Hops every night and whispered to the stars, "Thank you, Miss Emma. Love never goes away." It never does.